present the series The Fallen Fawn to discuss in detail the steps of arriving at a concept and then preparing for a shoot, conducting a shoot, editing, sequencing, retouching, printing, and editing and exhibiting. And then with whatever time is left over, I'll entertain whatever questions you may have about my process and the photo industry. And we can just have a candid conversation about any curiosities you may have. Okay, so this is a photograph that I recently discovered when looking through old albums at my dad's house. And it's just so much more to me than a snapshot taken during a family camping trip somewhere in Western Montana. It's real life 1977 captured forever in time. I see my mom on the left, she's cracking eggs. There's a flower in her hair, no doubt a gift from one of her children. I would be born later that year, and I wonder if she knew yet. I see my older sister, Nikki, just a baby herself, stretching out her expressive fingers. She would start to play the piano at 7 and go on to be a professional pianist, and her hands are still her most defining characteristics. My two older brothers, Jerry and Jesse, are immersed by something they've discovered in the creek nearby, while my two older sisters, Julie and Shelley, watch. And then little Nate is the only child that is confronting the viewer. The backdrop, we see the beast of an automobile, the Suburban that was used to transport our family of 12 as it endured multiple trips to Minnesota, at times hauled a barnyard full of 4-H animals to the county fair, and nearly killed my whole family during what we now refer to as the carbon monoxide incident. So this photo reminds me of why I love photography so much, why I think it's such an important craft, and why I continue to commit my life to this creative art form. So this is the home where I grew up in Missoula, Montana, as the youngest of 10 kids. And you can see how it got added on. When my parents first bought it, it was just this small farmhouse. And then in the 1980s, it extended from left to right. And so now at 42 years old, I have lived away from this home longer than I lived in it. And yet the settings for many of my dreams and my recollections of my most poignant memories occurred within these walls, and they're still as vivid as ever. And so I'm really captivated by that response. I'm very curious about childhood memory. For me personally, it tends to have a very vivid and cinematic quality to it. And I'm very interested by the complexities in general of childhood, the fleeting and subjective nature of memory. And I also use personal narrative as a form of feminist expression. And so these are my siblings, pretty easy to pick out there. And the names are Sean, Tom, Becky, Shelley, Jerry, Jesse, Julie, Nate, Nikki, Holly. Okay, so for Stories from a Short Street, this is a body of work I made in 2006, and it was the first body of work I did after completing my MFA, and it was ultimately inspired by my childhood. So for this series, I created a fictitious group of siblings that are loosely based on the archetypes of my own family. Each one of the images in this series was constructed to recreate a specific moment and depict a psychological portrait. So I'm choosing to just address the premise of this particular photo since it was the image that inspired the whole series. And it was influenced by an experience I had with hypnosis. So, how many of you have been hypnotized, gone through that process? Okay, so I used to have a paralyzing phobia of traveling. And now I do it all the time, save for this last year. So I did finally get over it. But at this time, I was having a lot of anticipatory anxiety about a trip to Boston where I was going to see my in-laws for Christmas. So I was having all this anxiety. I was really worried about it, and I someone had told me about the experience of hypnosis and how it can really help with irrational fear. And so I went to this hypnotherapist, and he walked me through this process of relaxation. And while I was about maybe 20 minutes in or so, he asked me if I could recall the first experience where I remember feeling this type of like just really all encompassing, terrifying anxiety. And immediately, with crystal clarity, I was teleported back to this incident from my childhood where my sister was giving me a home perm and she discovered lice in my hair. And now that I'm an adult, I understand that lice is pretty common. And it's hard for me to imagine because my family wasn't exactly the pillar of personal hygiene. But surprisingly, it was the first time that it had ever um, been detected in my house. And so it was this moment of total pandemonia where my sister had to catch this little bug in this salad dressing jar. And my mom, who rarely left the house, took this jar and put it in her black leather purse and drove to the drugstore to get the medicated shampoo. And meanwhile, I was quarantined in the bathroom while my brothers and sisters were frantically boiling all of our combs and barrettes and brushes. And I remember just feeling deeply ashamed and ostracized. And when she came back from the drugstore, we all had to line up and she scrubbed our heads in the bathtub. And it was a school night. And then we went to bed, and then my family never spoke about it again. And so, um, so it was this, well, it was a traumatic memory. And so while I was being hypnotized, I I was there and I could feel the sensation of my little fingers on the tablecloth, and I could smell the solution of the home perm with the potatoes and gravy, and I could feel the sun on my face. And while I was hypnotized in that moment, I thought to myself, this would be an interesting memory to recreate photographically. And my early foundation in painting continues to inform my photographic work. And my aesthetic has definitely been inspired by my Catholic upbringing and exposure to religious iconography. So here you see a clear reference to the Last Supper, while here a litter of kittens in a barn becomes the Nativity. As in all of the other Short Street images, adult authority and supervision remains off camera. My home was kind of like growing up um, in the lawless land. And so there are many layers that I was trying to portray in this portrait of my brother. His larger than life masculine shadow projected on the wall is superimposed over an Old West painting. He's wearing a patriotic long johns, pajamas, and then there's the deer head. Taxidermy and hunting was a big pastime in my family. And the deer is the only direct gaze with the viewer and almost seems to be whispering secrets in the little boy's ear. So I was attempting to convey some of the themes, traits, and values that were reinforced and encouraged in my brothers. But as with every image, there's something unresolved, and it was my hope to create a tension between the past, the present, and the future moment. I also spent my youth admiring my 4 older sisters, and because we only had one bathroom upstairs where all the bedrooms were and one bathroom downstairs, I would watch them go through these really extensive rituals in their bedrooms at their vanities. And it seemed like a very important education for me in becoming a woman. So this photo is about that process. I used repetitive mirrors as a symbol for narcissism and self-reflection, as this image suggests that period in a girl's life where they start to see themselves through other people's eyes, and consequently sometimes develop an unhealthy preoccupation with their appearance. Also, as a photographer, I'm interested in the notion of spectatorship, or simply put, the act of looking, and the power dynamic between the spectator, the artist, the viewer, the consumer, and the spectacle, the subject. And so I try to seek ways to implicate the viewer without relying directly on a gaze. Now, I should note that this whole series was shot on a large format 4x5 camera, and everything was done in camera. Probably today, I would do a bit of compositing, and I might position the figure in the foreground differently, or this would just be an example of how my process has been impacted now that I essentially exclusively work digitally. So speaking of the gaze and the power dynamic between the viewer and the subject, so in this photograph, I'm suggesting off-camera action through Fiona's gaze. And my hope being was to create a more interactive experience with the viewer, an opportunity for them to imagine whose gaze she's responding to and what that dynamic is. Um, Oftentimes people will ask me how I choose my models or how I find them. And at this point in my life, I was still in graduate school, so I didn't really have a lot of peers that had children at the time. That's changed now. So I actually used Craigslist, which at the time was a very effective tool for artists. And I put a posting that I was an artist that was embarking on a fine art photo series, and I didn't have any photo work. My thesis work was video based. My undergrad work was painting, but I knew I wanted to do a photo project. I had the opportunity to go to the Pompidou Art Museum in Paris, and I had this really transformational experience as a young aspiring artist, where I recognized that the work that I was most drawn to, most compelled to, kept coming back to, was most excited by, was the large format photography. And so I thought, well, seems like that should then be the work that I should be making. So um so anyway, I had cast this family through children that whose headshots arrived via email from parents that I found on Craigslist. And with the exception of Fiona, who I first noticed long before I was working on the series and even long before the hypnosis incident. And I was at a coffee shop in my neighborhood, and I remember seeing her and just being very allured by her. I remember thinking she was really interesting and that she would be very compelling to photograph. I remember saying that to myself. She had this kind of haunting appearance. And then several months ago, I was procuring props and going to yard sales and thrift stores to try to find costumes and things like that for this project. And I happened to go to her family's yard sale. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is serendipitous. How can I not ask? So their family was, they were intrigued enough to take a chance. Okay, so now I'm going to segue into another series. Um, and this is what I probably consider my breakthrough series. It's called Sparrow Lane. And it was actually influenced by a conversation that I had with my young friend Fiona after we'd worked on the short story series. And she was telling me with so much enthusiasm that she'd been reading the Nancy Drew novels. And it was so delightful to reminisce with her because I too had read Nancy Drew when I was a young girl. And I couldn't recall a single plot, but I realized that the provocative images from the book covers were still nestled in my mind. And so I revisited them, and studying the covers, you can see a melodrama in the body language of the characters, the way their hands frame the scenes, the separation of the fingers, and the startling but lovely expressions on their faces. And I opted to emulate this aesthetic and intentionally posed my subjects in a very hyper mannered way. So, Sparrow Lane is a series that is ultimately about adolescent girls who are on the cusp of acquiring forbidden knowledge, which is a metaphor for that precarious transition from girl to woman. And I'm interested in that space that lies in between when a female starts to feel simultaneously vulnerable and empowered as she transitions into womanhood. As you will see, my protagonists are empowered by a discovery, but there's also an essence of impending threat. And I'm interested in addressing these themes in an implicit versus explicit way. So these girls are potentially embarking on danger, but ultimately the work is void of any explicit violence or sexuality. They are very innocent, much like the Nancy Drew narratives and book covers. But rather, it's that potential of losing their innocence that most interests me. So, my photo process has been highly informed and influenced by the work of classic cinema, such as Alfred Hitchcock's work. And you know, it's interesting. It was recently I gave a lecture to a high school class, and I said, "How many of you has seen an Alfred Hitchcock film?" And literally nobody in the class had even heard about Alfred Hitchcock. So I know that's probably not the case with this group, but um, so so Alfred Hitchcock, you know, his work is very has a lot of theatrical lighting, rich color combinations, and formal compositions. He was also a master at creating visual clues to communicate narratives without relying on dialogue. And I find myself both compelled and concerned by Hitchcock's peculiar relationship with women, A lot has been written about this, of course, since the time that he was working. But on one hand, for the time period, he was unusually writing and leading ladies as protagonists in his films. They were far more dimensional than most at that time, but ultimately they always paid for it with his sadism towards them. Some of the most informative films I recall as a child were horror films that portrayed complex female characters. Often they were the subjects of brutal betrayal, but ultimately their strengths were reasserted by the film's end. So, certainly, the historical context in which these films were made, in particular, the advancements and subsequent threat of 1970s second wave feminism, contributed to the conflicting messages these films present about female identity. So, the tension, as well as just the sheer visual aesthetic, has influenced my process, um, most notably while working on Sparrow Lane. Likewise, I also consider the work of mid century female surrealists as influential, in particular, their interests in psychoanalysis and the way that they metaphorically depict fears, desires, and impulses. So, through the series, you'll see familiar iconography such as mirrors, bird cages, chrome flashlights, spilt milk, secret passageways, skeleton keys, and hidden objects used as psychosexual metaphors. Of course, we all know that at the most rudimentary level, photography is about capturing light. And not only do I employ light as a formal device to emphasize my characters often, but I also use it as a content carrier. So here, the illumination of light in and of itself suggests some sort of revelation. The photos weren't all shot in the same room of the same house or even the same neighborhood, though I did want to imply that the girls were sleuthing around some sort of grand fictitious estate, which probably would be easier to come by in your neck of the woods. Um, but my hope was being to unify the narratives and to try to situate the viewer within this space. Um, so, through my titles, I'm also referencing the conventions of narrative mystery novels and their idyllic names that I read as a young girl. I tried to be really conscientious of the spaces that my characters exist within. And instead of finding a house to shoot in, I did a lot of art directing and styling to completely transform an existing space, usually my own home, to look like whatever sort of vision I had in my mind's eye. So they can really be thought of as installations that I might spend up to a week working on and then activate with the characters and document photographically. So, for example, in this image, I wanted to employ complementary colors of red and green, but I couldn't find the right garish wallpaper. Certainly, I couldn't find a house that had it. So I designed it on my computer and then printed it out on 11 by 8.5 sheets of paper, which I then affixed to my living room wall. So again, even though this space is outside, it too can be thought of as a set as well. And there's an artifice that's employed intentionally, again, using complementary colors as well as faux taxidermy birds and cinematic lighting. And the pre production is a really big part of my conceptual process. I engage in a lot of thrift shopping. I oftentimes will find an object that I then craft a narrative around. So, for example, I found this pair of like super iconic mittens at a craft fair here in Portland. They were so stiff, they weren't even really wearable. They almost functioned as a symbol of a mitten, like if you saw a mitten on a highway sign or something. And so then I purchased them with the intention to inspire a story. And one of the things that has been fascinating to continue to observe about this series is just the continuum in which the viewer responds to the work. Like, so for example, maybe a young child might look at this photograph and think that, oh, that girl dropped something red or a mitten or a whatever, and she's reaching over to pick it up. But then when this series was reviewed in Art in America, the writer Sue Taylor, whose background is in Freudian theory and feminist psychoanalysis, she made a whole bunch of readings about the work that I was not aware of on a conscious level anyway. And so, for example, she um, described the red mitten as this kind of warm, womb-like vessel, and that melodramatic shadow on the blue skirt as menstrual blood dripping down the girl's leg. Though Sparrow Lane was shot on a large format film, I've never perceived the camera as an agent of truth, probably because my background is in painting and drawing. And so for this series, I concocted a set of identical twins by using a single subject matter. And I was able to achieve this by photographing her in two different locations, having her switch clothes, and then compositing the images together. This series was also photographed on large format film. So at that time, it usually cost me about $100 to scan a negative. So I couldn't really do that much digitizing. Um, but I was able to do that with these two photographs. And like most people, I find identical twins mysterious and compelling, and I wanted to explore the idea of them as counterparts, equivalents, or accomplices embarking on these discoveries together. So here's an example of how my process might work. So I set up a scene, and then I would get the contact sheets back and I would scan them and just make really rough, dirty composites in Photoshop. From there, I could get a sense of the most ideal character interaction and the formal unity. And eventually, I selected the lower right because I felt like I had the most, it most effectively guided the viewer's eye around the frame. Okay. Um, so oftentimes the narratives in my work are abstractions of real life events relayed to me by the actual participants in the images, like most of you all, I presume. When someone tells you a really compelling story, a film strip of sorts illustrates, um, well, in my mind, I kind of assume that that's a response that a lot of visual people have. And so at this time, I was collecting particular childhood memories of people in which their mothers performed heroic acts in an attempt to protect them. So my friend Anna was telling me about the story where her mom was taking a carload of kids to a birthday party and a fire erupted underneath the hood of the car. So her mom had to swerve to the side of the road and individually schlep all of these kids out of the car. And I remember when she was telling me the story, um, saying to her, "Oh my goodness, we should make a photo series out of that story." So at that point, I was less interested in the specifics. I never asked her what was the model of the car, what time of year was it, who were the kids in the car. I was most interested in trying to recreate the vision that was in my mind when Anna told me the story. And of course, there's always grief when you work this way, because um, there is always going to be a discrepancy between the vision in your mind and then what you're capable of capturing with the camera, because of, whatever obstacles might be in the way. But what I have found, because I feel like that's a pretty predictable response for me at this point, is that if I table the work for a little bit of time and then come back to it, I can see it with fresh eyes, and I can see things that in some cases are even stronger than what I imagined I could create. Okay, so I'm gonna like pretty quickly go through this because I feel like I'm talking to some pretty seasoned artists here. So I break my process up into three parts: the pre-production phase, which is the ideation, mood board, location scouting. Sometimes I will see a location and I'll think, oh, I want to photograph there. I think that's going to be really interesting. That'll be interesting backdrop, and then that might inspire an idea. Likewise, that also happens with people that I see or props that I procure. Um, so then I storyboard, secure any collaborators that might help. And then the second phase is production, and that's the actual shoot. And that is a very exhilarating phase. But like I said, there's always that grief between, and always this tension. It's all about problem solving, all this tension about how do I accomplish what I've been imagining in my mind with the whatever adversity that day throws my way. And then finally, the post production, which is the editing, the sequencing, retouching, the printing, and exhibiting. All right, so I'm going to show you this this last project. And so, as I mentioned, most of my personal work is inspired by memories or real life events that have been revealed to me by other people. And so, the catalyst for this series that I want to discuss is based on the stories that my two older sisters told me a few Thanksgivings ago, probably 5 Thanksgivings. And they were telling me that when they were young girls, they discovered a lost or abandoned woman's suitcase at the river's edge by our house. And knowing that it was a valuable treasure, they took it home, they hid it under the bed, and when they could, often at night or when they had some more privacy, they would dress up in this mystery woman's belongings. And they would dress up in her clothes, wrap their hair in her curlers, wear her lipstick. And so while we were sharing this memory as adults, we found ourselves asking, who the heck was that woman? Why was her suitcase down at the river's edge? And why didn't it occur to them to take it to an adult? I think it even had a wallet that had this woman's ID in it. So long after the conversation, I found myself thinking about the woman and the possibility that my sisters, then just two curious, naive girls, could have unearthed a treasure trove containing a sinister secret. So the story has all of the narrative motifs that most interest me, and that's why I set out to make a series about it. So the Fallen Fawn is sequenced to illustrate two parallel narratives. The sister discovering the suitcase, the sister is discovering the suitcase, and then the subsequent consequences of harboring the secret. And then the other part of the narrative is the implicit tale of the woman who I dubbed the fallen fawn, and which is revealed through her deserted belongings left to be discovered in the woods. So now that I've contextualized it, I'm just gonna go through and let you experience the images. Okay, so so back to the pre-production of the project. So this is a process that I've adapted over the last several years, where I create a mood board. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Pinterest, but I find it to be a really effective tool for um, the way that it opens up new inspiration by whatever sort of um, programs are embedded in it. But so, obviously my work is very cinematic and really influenced by old film still. So this would be an example of some reference images that I found that inspired just kind of the overall aesthetic of the project. I also engage in a lot of thrift shopping. I love collecting things. I'm always dragging things home from the side of the road. Um, it's a big part of the concept development for me. When I'm kind of stuck and I can't really come up with an idea, I actually go thrift shopping and I literally wear earplugs so that I'm not distracted by a child bouncing a basketball or the music or other people talking, and I can be less distracted by all those variables and just more perceptive and more open to ideas. I love to go to estate sales. I find it really, really fun, super fascinating to pilfer through the drawers and closets of people who inhabited the spaces, oftentimes for several decades. And I like to imagine what their lives were like. And I always try to find like some sort of souvenir, some sort of treasure to take home with me. So prior to working on Fallen Fawn, I found this estate sale, and it was like walking into a immaculately art directed film set. And I instantly knew that I wanted to photograph there. I later learned that the woman who lived there was 100 years old when she died. And there was evidence that the bed had been taken downstairs, and it had probably been decades since anybody had even really been upstairs. And so, my with a little bit of sleuthing and help from my sister, who's a real estate agent, I was able to track down the new homeowner who actually bought the house sight unseen, but it was next door. She had never been in it, but it was next door to a commercial space that she owns. And she bought it while being out of town with the intention of leveling it to make a parking lot. But she too kind of fell in love with it. And so she gave me the permission to rent it for a week. And so I moved on in. Unfortunately, all the things had been taken out of it, but it still had the wallpaper. And I spent a couple days cleaning and propping up the house. And then I photographed it for 3 days. And so I was going to go through and kind of talk a little bit about um, the shooting, but it looks like we're kind of starting to get a little bit close to time. So why don't I just go ahead and
Keep going. You can keep going, Holly.
okay. So okay, you let me know if give me a any indication if you want me to wrap it up. Okay, so what I was going to say is part of so when I was working on Stories from a Short Street and Sparrow Lane, I was a teacher at the time, and I didn't have a lot of, I could only work on the weekends, and I would make maybe a photograph a month. But now that I am a photographer, I do editorial work, commercial work, my own fine art, I have learned how to be more efficient, learned how to um, have a more supportive team of collaborators versus just relying on friends, which is what I used to do. And so I've become a lot more efficient. So, like I said, I spent a few days working in the house, and the the two girls, they actually are their neighbors who grew up together, and so they um, were really comfortable with one another. And actually, this is a cameo of me in the as the mother. And so they once I told them the implied narrative, Agatha is on the right and Rhea is on the left. Like I said, they're best friends. And so they were really precocious, they were a dream to work with. And they just kind of started playing. And then from there, I just started photographing. And these are some of my outtakes that didn't make it into the series, but you can kind of see some of the ways that we were working in the space. And so this was the one that I selected. And I'm going to toggle to the next image because that is the image after my retouching work. So you can kind of see this is out of camera, and this is what happens after I clean it up before I print it. Boom, boom. And then here's another example. This one I selected, and this is before and after. Most of the objects are from my private collection, and you will see them reoccur. in other images and series. It's kind of like a little inside joke with myself. So the deer, I had this image in my mind's eye of the woman kind of being symbolic of this deer. And I grew up in Montana, and I felt like at any given time I knew someone who had a deer that was living in their yard. It's just a thing. And so I thought, oh, surely I should be able to find a deer that could be in this photograph. And I actually looked at some kind of different entities that raise animals specifically for films and photos. And deer, I learned, are very, very sensitive. They can die from stress. It's illegal to transport them. And so I did what I often do. I went onto Facebook and I said, hey, I'm looking to photograph a deer. Does anyone know someone who has a semi-friendly deer that's been kind of hanging around their house, willing to travel? And so someone tipped me off to this marijuana eating deer that OPB, which is our version of public PBS, did this story on this medical marijuana grower and how this really exquisite, beautiful little deer lived on the property. And so I called this person up and I drove 5 hours down to spend a weekend with this deer. I love deer, as you can see, and was able to make this photograph. And so when I call them, they're like, well, it's not a pet. So sometimes it's here, sometimes it's not, but you can come and, maybe it will be here. And when I showed up, it was in the living room laying on the rug. So and then you can see I got rid of the antlers in post because I wanted it to be a fawn. Okay, so I think I'm ready to field some questions. Do you have any?
Okay, now's your shot, people.
Well, so the photo that we're looking at, you showed the before and after. So how do you recreate the lighting effects you want? I'm assuming you're using Photoshop or some other editor.
I do use Photoshop. So, okay, so you're referring to the way that
Yeah,
it just
you've
it looks like
the light and the wallpaper, that type of thing behind the woman.
yeah. So I probably do some adjustment layers. I use curves, and I might do like an S curve to create more contrast. But then I also do some digital dodging and burning, where I probably went in and painted some highlights or some exposure in probably increase the exposure on the faces, and maybe on some of the wrinkles. I can't exactly remember what I did, but you can also see areas where I cleaned it up. Like, for example, if you look at the light over there, the light bulb that we were using was too hot for the lamp shade. Oops. And so it burned it. And so you can see how it's damaged. You can see it in the reflection. And so I touched that up. But yeah, so I use Photoshop, and I'm actually self-taught in Photoshop, and probably not the most efficient practitioner, but I've spent a lot of time just playing around. I mean, I have a background in painting, so I think that really helps. And I use a Wacom tablet and a pen, which makes that process a lot more organic, and as far as a painterly process, I find it to be a lot more satisfying than a mouse.
So you're just using standard dodge burn techniques, using curves or whatever way that you dodge and burn. I was curious if you might have used some lighting effects from another plugin or another program.
No, the answer is no, but I would be curious about that stuff. Is there such a thing?
There are, but I'm not an expert on it. So I mean,
Yeah.
You could just Google it and
Yeah. You probably have to dial them down, I bet, fresh out of
yeah.
it's like an action or whatever. Yeah, I'm curious about that stuff. I haven't I guess my guess is that whatever they've built is based on the tools that are accessible to all of us in
Mhm.
Photoshop, and then they've kind of figured out a way to use to compile all these functions. And yeah.
Yeah. Just one other question. I excuse me. Your photos seem to have a very distinct color palette.
Mhm.
It sort of carries through on your series. They're not exact, but how do you manage to keep the consistency, the look and feel of the palette, especially across multiple projects?
Well, so I think color is something that I'm not very good at talking about, but I think it's something that it probably comes I have a pretty natural understanding of what I'm drawn to, the colors that I think will work well together. And certainly using supplemental lighting creates more vivid and dramatic colors. But I think in general, I love blue and teal and green and pink and red. And then I do some modifying of colors sometimes in post. Like, for example, I wanted all of the fallen fawns, all of her objects to be blue. The car is blue, the suitcase is blue, so it would kind of unify them. This is a brown suitcase, so I changed the color to be blue. So I think part of it is selecting whatever is within the frame to have a certain color that I think is cohesive, and then also whatever sort of color correction I do is probably consistent, and I think that probably also helps to unify.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm noticing that there's such a narrative cohesion between your shots, and that you talk about basically storyboarding it, and then you execute a series of stills. And I know that you said that I guess in your graduate work you were actually working with video, and I'm kind of intrigued. I mean, this really seems like action, movement, video, film, whatever might be equally appropriate. And I'm wondering what it is that draws you to doing stills as opposed to making movies.
That's a really great question. So I think that motion film is so powerful and so persuasive in that it has the implied narrative and the same kind of gorgeous elements within a scene, and then it also has movement, and then it has the rhythm of the cutting, and then it has the sound, and it has all of these ways of really activating all of our senses but yet I feel like there's something really powerful about a still static image where like, the only thing you have to contend with is your own beating heart. And and that quietness. And I think that I feel more comfortable with a still image because I spent so much time as a child painting and drawing, and then in undergrad and graduate school, painting and drawing. So really thinking about the picture plane and the positive forms, the figures, and how they interact with the negative space. And if the camera starts to move or the objects start to move within the frame, then the composition falls apart. I feel like there's a loss of control there. I will say I am very interested in cinema and motion film. I just directed a music video, and I directed my first commercial, my first TV commercial. So I kind of see that's where my professional trajectory is moving, and I feel kind of intimidated by it. There's a lot more moving parts, I think. And I guess that kind of, I could talk a lot more about that, I am sure. But I think that probably addresses some of the reasons why I have worked in photo for the last 10 or 15 years.
Well, this is just a comment, kind of backing up on that. The characters you're creating are somber interior characters, and it's almost like they're sucking gravity. You know, time stops when you look at these images. And yeah, I think motion would just create a totally different quality to it. So I think that's very, you know, when you think you photograph a lot of girls,
Yeah.
and a lot of girls, depending on generations, could be giggly and smiley, or just acting in a different, more spontaneous way. Everything is very studied about your girls, your young women, and they are not giving away themselves, you know. And it's kind of an invitation to look into their faces, and almost a dare, and figure them out. I think
Yeah, that's a good point. And just on kind of a pragmatic level, it would require probably more skilled performers and more skill as a director
do
to
people,
have that consistent essence through a scene in a film.
do people seek out your work to buy still individual photographs within the images?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah,
Okay.
that is my hope, is that each photograph stands alone as its own narrative, but then when included in the sequence, then it kind of becomes something else too.
Okay, Holly, Jock had a question. Could you talk about your approach to lighting?
Yeah, so let's see here. Seem to be kind of hung up here. Well, you know, every project, every image is a little bit different. I can tell you, for example, how I lit this shot. I wanted to try to emulate the way that a dining room might be lit. And so I used a lantern, a chimera lantern, and I used a boom to place it over the table where a lighting fixture would be. And a lantern is a, big globe that is, when you construct it, it's like wire and diffusion. And then that was the single light source. And then I had a V flat, a white V flat, where I was bouncing light from the floor just right in front of my tripod to fill in light on the tablecloth. So that would be an example for this particular image. This is natural light here, which is very unusual for me. I rarely use natural light. Usually I use at least one, probably two light sources. I like to use the ProPhoto B1 battery operated kit. That's my go-to. This was shot in natural light on a really, really bright sunny day, and I just really underexposed it. Again, this is natural light. Let's see here. This was primarily, actually this was natural light, but then it was really speckly, super unforgiving shade. I placed the subjects under the shade and then illuminated them with a big strobe. Maybe it was on a huge like a umbrella, maybe like a 4-foot umbrella. I can't really remember. I know for this image, I photographed the party separate. And then I photographed the car, and then I pieced them together.
How'd you generate the smoke?
A smoke machine. Yeah, or a fog machine or something like that. So yeah, so I guess my go-to is I usually have probably high side light that has some diffusion. I like side light because it creates texture and more drama. And then I generally use some backlight and then probably some fill on the left-hand side of wherever the side light's coming from, where the key light is. But honestly, I'm not the type of person who draws out diagrams of lighting. It's not really where my strengths lie. There's a lot of like moving lights and firing. That's why digital is such a blessing for me at this point, because I feel like I can fire away and see how the light is interacting, and then I can continue to tweak it on the set.
Hey, anybody else have anything for Holly?
Well, I was going to say this was an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
and your work is stunning, actually. That's
Oh, thank you.
that's an overused word, but it really is. And I really appreciated and enjoyed listening to you and seeing your photographs.
Thank you so much. Stay in touch. Say hi to me on Instagram, or you can send me an email at holly@hollyandrews.com. I would love to see a link to your work. Send me
Okay.
your websites. I want to see what you're making. I love all the times when I've been able to visit Atlanta, and looking forward to doing some more traveling in the future once we get through this pandemic.
Beautiful work. That was a beautiful presentation. Thank you for sharing the experience. Really, really.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for being
what a
such captive
treat.
listeners and great questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Next month, we have Bruce Barnbaum. And that'll be on Thursday, May 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. And the recording will be up tomorrow. So if you want to come back and look at anything, feel free.
Thanks so much, Holly. So
Yeah.
very
You're welcome.
you.
Yeah, thanks again. I really
Really great.
appreciate it.
Love it.
Thank you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Mike.
much.
Oh, thank you
Thank
so much.
Thank you all.
Time.
Thanks so much.
inspiring.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.